future now.
Oh, no, sorry. I think if I do that, I mute everybody, including Colin. Sorry, to cut Colin off.
So what does that mean, David? That
they'll be muted on entry, but they can unmute themselves.
Okay, perfect.
Sorry.
Okay, I have that at 9 o'clock. Does that mean we start letting people in?
Let's let them know.
Yeah. Good morning to everyone joining us. Welcome. We'll just have a couple of minutes to let everyone get on the call before we make a start. Colin, I think that's you. I can hear. Thank you. Good morning, everyone that's joining. We'll just watch the numbers tick up a tiny bit more and then we'll make a start. Morning, Xerxes. So nice to see your face. Okay, I suggest we make a start so we don't lose any more time. Morning, everybody. I'm Rebecca Bailey, the Programme Director of Towards a National Collection, and I'm really just topping and tailing the event today and have the very glamorous task of talking you through the Zoom rules for the day. So during the presentations, if everybody, I think the default now is that your mics are switched off, but you can turn them back on for the presenters and for anyone that's called in to ask a question later. For everybody's bandwidth, once we get going with presentations, it's probably best to turn your cameras off. We're going to have the 3 presentations back to back and then have a single Q&A session referring to all 3 presentations, particularly to allow if people have questions that they want to address to more than one of the presenters. But what you can do, of course, is during the presentations, use the chat function to record your questions or record your desire to ask a question. It's helpful if you say the subject matter. Carlotta, our researcher, she's in my top corner, so I'm waving at her, is going to try and corral the questions. So if people are asking similar things, she'll try and group them together. And for some questions, particularly if you're being a bit trickier, we will call on you to switch on your camera and ask your question yourself. I hope that sounds okay for everyone. we're super, super grateful to have our speakers here today. Carlotta is going to introduce them, but I just wanted to give my personal thanks because they're all in the other half of the world. So they're in a very different time zone for us. It's not too bad in Japan, but our friends in New Zealand have stayed up very late to talk to us. So we're very, very grateful. Although they have just been telling us what COVID is like in New Zealand, and we're feeling a bit jealous now. So I'm going to hand over to Carlotta, who's going to explain the rationale behind our new seminar series and introduce the speakers.
Thank you, Rebecca. Thank you, everyone, for being here today. It's quite a turnout. We're very happy. I'm Carlotta Paltrinieri, and I am TaNC, so Towards the National Collection, abbreviated, senior researcher, and I will very briefly introduce you to the series and to our speakers today. So the idea behind this series is to hear from projects around the world that have been successful at building a national collection that links digital objects from different institutions across what we call the GLAM sector, and that could inspire TaNC's mission. So this series is itself part of a larger benchmarker review on international initiatives that are relevant to TaNC in scope, in scale, and in impact. So today we have the honor to listen to two excellent examples of a virtual national collection and listening to their experience in best practice across all areas, so technology, engagement, inclusivity, and openness, and will surely be beneficial to us and to our audience today and in the future. So we will hear first from Fiona Fieldsend, the Director of DigitalNZ, and Mark Crookston, Program Director of the Documentary Heritage at the National Library of New Zealand, who will tell us more about the incredible DigitalNZ and their projects for the future. And then we will hear from Professor Akihiko Takano, Chair of the Practitioner Review Committee of JapanSearch, who will present the great achievement of JapanSearch. And I will stop now and give the floor to Fiona. So thank you again to everyone and to our speakers today.
Kia ora koutou. I will just get screen sharing and take it away. Okay, hopefully that's all looking right. Colin, let me know if it isn't. I will get started unless I hear from you. Tēnā koutou I ngā āhuatanga o te wā. Ko Fiona Fieldsend taku ingoa, kei te punamatanga o Aotearoa ahua e mahi ana. Hei kai whakahaere matihi ko whiako. Nō reira, tēnā koutou katoa. Kia ora, I'm Fiona Fieldsend. I'm the Director of Digital Experience at National Library of New Zealand. And that was my mihi. It gives you a little bit of a sense of where I come from and also the importance of te reo, the language of the Māori culture in New Zealand. But today I'm here to share the journey we are taking in Aotearoa, New Zealand, to help make New Zealand content easy to find, share and use, and how we've tried to dissolve barriers between different collections, opening New Zealand heritage to New Zealand and to the world. So it's quite a similar goal. And I copied some of your goals there, but trying to make some connections across the way. Digital New Zealand Atihi Aotearoa kicked off with much fanfare back in 2008 with the tagline of helping make New Zealand content easier to find, share and use. It was a project initially funded out of the 2007 Digital Content Strategy, which had the subheading of Creating a Digital New Zealand. This was the partner strategy to the then New Zealand digital strategy. It was recognised that it was all very well developing a digital infrastructure for our nation, but there needed to be investment into what actually fills the pipes and what people need to interact with. The funding for Digital New Zealand back then aimed to set up the ongoing infrastructure to deliver exemplars that demonstrate what is possible when there is a concerted effort to improve access and discovery of New Zealand content. And we took what we dubbed a test lab approach. We identified and worked on potential solutions to some of the many issues that prevent access, use and discovery of New Zealand digital content. We're a small country in a big world, and finding New Zealand content was challenging. And boy, did we go ahead and build some exemplars back then to show what was possible. Of course, we built a search across a very wide number of collections from the GLAM sector and beyond, but core to that was what we believe was the world's first culture and heritage open API. This enabled us to build things like widgets that people could embed collection searches on their blogs and websites, and we worked with developers on what was then a new thing, different visualizations of what collections look like. And we also had a go at a collaborative remix showcase, which was an example of us trying to show what was possible when you could free the licensing of publicly available content for reuse and remixing. And back then, it was the first time many of the GLAM institutions in New Zealand had tried opening up their content for reuse. It was a new thing, and it was a bit of a mind shift back then. The program also explored policy and capability exemplars, so looking at ways for us to improve access to advice around digital standards, formats, and protocols. We had a draft framework to help organisations prioritise content for digitisation, and we even ran a public tool for people out in the public to vote for the content that they wanted GLAM sector to digitise. We also published best practice guidance on creating digital content, which included flowcharts on identifying public domain materials and on how to work out copyright expiry. This was what became the Make It Digital service, which is still around today and remains a very popular part of our service, if a little under-resourced right now. However, our core and fundamental achievement was enabling search across multiple organisations' collections. You know, that world's first culture and heritage open API. We like to have world firsts here in little old New Zealand. And this remains the core of Digital New Zealand today. We're enabling metadata aggregation and making that data available for reuse and use to improve discovery, bringing together New Zealand Aotearoa content so it's easy to find in one place. Back then, though, hardly anyone in the GLAM sector knew what an API was, and one of our biggest challenges was convincing our content partners that it was a good idea to let people use their data. One of our key success factors back then, and still actually, is that we made it as easy as possible to participate. We've designed our metadata harvesting technology so that we do all the heavy lifting. We're able to work with almost any kind of metadata. It just needs to have a title and a persistent URL. And if we hadn't have done this back then, we wouldn't have got the uptake back in 2008. And actually, we wouldn't be maintaining the scale that we're at now. So we're able to work with a very wide range of metadata quality, and we're open to that in order to get the participation and the content connected and easier to find. We also made the participation terms as simple as we could and clear. And this was all before CC0 and the concept of open data release. In some ways, we were a bit too early in that respect because we've put some terms over the data use that maybe we wouldn't have done if we'd waited a year or two and worked with CC0 and other options. So now we have over 200 content partners and well over 30 million items, and the team is growing that every day. We also have a range of services that use the API to enhance content discovery. And we've also made our data aggregation infrastructure open source so that others can use it. An example of people using the API, this is Seismic, the University of Canterbury and Christchurch used the Digital New Zealand API to bring together content related to the Canterbury earthquakes. And it's powered by Digital New Zealand. And I'd be remiss if I didn't say that the National Library of New Zealand's collection search is also powered by our search infrastructure. Which brings me to a small plug for Supplejack. This is the open source metadata aggregation and discovery management tool that we have. So if you happen to have disparate data sets of metadata that you want to aggregate and bring together, well, we've got the open source product for you. That infrastructure has made it possible for us to build digitalpacific.org in the last year. This is an initiative that is bringing together digital items by, for and about Pacific people. And we're really proud of this initiative. It was co-designed with Pacific people over the lockdown we had here in New Zealand, so completely online. And importantly, it was completely collaborative and built in collaboration with National Library of Australia and funded by Australia's Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, and all built on Digital New Zealand infrastructure. But back to DNZ, Digital New Zealand, and where we are now. Over the years, our investment has not been as generous as the heyday of 2008 and the early years. Digital New Zealand is now a small, agile team who focus on the aggregation of digital content metadata and making that as easy as possible for people to connect to New Zealand digital content, and to also make the user experience, to use user experience approaches to build new ways to experience and interact with that content. So an example is the way we try to use accessible and informal language to describe and present the content in the search interface, as well as helping people to understand licensing and rights, and making it as easy as possible for them to know how they can use the content that they discover. So an example is this traffic light system. So this one is all green, but of course if something had restrictions, you would be seeing reds, and then accessible language describing what you can be doing with it. As well as that, we develop stories so that people can bring together items of interest to them from across the many content partners collections that they've discovered through the Digital New Zealand search. So this is an example of a publisher here in New Zealand bringing together content that appeared in a particular book about the Treaty of Waitangi. We make it possible in the stories interface for people to build their own narrative, to add titles and captions, and to enhance the story around the collection items that they've discovered. Just recently, we've built an upload, so people are able to now upload their personal items into the story interface and make the connections between the collection items of the GLAM sector and beyond, because we also work with organisations beyond the GLAM sector, because New Zealand content is in a lot of places with their own items. And this is an example. So what you're actually seeing is the very first pavlova I made back in 2018. But this long story hasn't really taken us, I don't think, to where you're all aspiring to go. DNZ has not taken Aotearoa very far towards a national collection. I don't think, certainly in my mind, in what I think the definition of national collection is. We make it easier to discover New Zealand content in one go, but with the crunching of our funding over the years, what's dissolved away is that innovation, that test lab approach that I was talking about before, and we have a necessary focus on BAU, on aggregation, keeping the service going and improving the experience while amplifying access to the digital content. But what I can say is we are talking more at the National Library about what the next stage in digital and content strategy might look like. What are the technical, digital, policy and capability platforms that we could be collaborating on across the sector so that New Zealanders will easily access, share and use New Zealand's knowledge resources. That slide there is coming from the National Library of New Zealand's strategy to 2030, which has 3 pillars around taonga or collections and looking after them well, reading and their knowledge. How can we connect people to the information they need to create new knowledge and innovate? So we're working on something and we'll keep in touch on how that's going. But I think it's time for my colleague Mark to talk a little bit more about broader strategic work around collecting and the documentary heritage strategy. So that's me. I look forward to interacting with you later, and you're welcome to contact me if you have any specific questions after the session.
Thanks, Fiona. Kia ora koutou, ko Mark Crookston tako ingoa. My name is Mark Crookston. I am the Program Director of Documentary Heritage at the National Library of New Zealand. It's part of my role is to look to try and bring the documentary heritage sort of sector together, establish some national priorities, and understand the interventions that can take place at a national, regional, or local level that can have a multiplier effect somewhere else and across the sector. So how do we pull everything together to make sure collectively we're doing the right things so that New Zealand's knowledge can be created, the right stuff is being created, it can be documented, it can be found in the right kind of repositories, not necessarily the national ones, and used. So it's a great job title. I've only been in it for a few months, but I'm here to tell you about some of the context of why this role was created. A little bit about sort of the intention that we have and some of the approaches that we're taking both in the National Library, but sort of more broadly about moving towards this idea of a national collection. So I hope it's of interest to whatever your project is for all you listening, but already just looking at towards the National Collection Project, I think there's some quite very close similarities to what our thinking, our initial thinking is in New Zealand and the journey that you guys are embarking on. So this notion of national, and what is it really? I'd like to bring together a few threads here. The first is in terms of New Zealand, some basic demographics. The most recent census 2018 stated that there were about 70% of New Zealanders were of European descent, about 17% Indigenous Māori, 13% Asian, 9% Pacific. That equals more than 100, but they haven't released yet the youth figures from that census. So I'm pulling these stats from the 2013 census in New Zealand. Of 0 to 14-year-olds, over 30% identified as, I think it was 32% identified as Pacific, 31% Indigenous Māori, 20% Asian, and about 14% of 0 to 14-year-olds in New Zealand were of European descent. So you can see we're in the middle of this really significant shift in demography that will, within about a generation, kind of fundamentally change who New Zealand is and the lens through which we view and understand culture and identity. The second part is sort of an analysis of our existing collections. We know that for collecting institutions of documentary heritage, the predominant source of those collections is through donation from individuals or interest groups in New Zealand. So some analysis of our donors and our donation program and the collections that have come from that within the National Library of New Zealand concluded most donations came from women of European descent. Most of those collections were about men, which mostly came through women as well. Most collections about the Pacific, which is a mandated collection focus of the library, and I'll talk a bit more about our collection focuses later. Most collections about the Pacific are documenting experiences of people of European descent in the Pacific, or views of Pacific people from the perspective of European descent, so diaries, photos, etc., that have been taken by Europeans. And that the collections that document the experience of recent migrants in New Zealand, i.e. about the sort of last 20 years, are virtually non-existent in the National Library of New Zealand. And I've been talking with colleagues up and down the country and asking the question on the extent to which that analysis of the collections holds true for theirs as well, and 100% yes. So there's that as well. We know that the collections are biased and that there's huge gaps, especially in relation to who we are and who we're going to be in New Zealand. We also know that for people, communities or organizations that aren't already aware of or believe in collecting institutions, there's usually considerable gaps in time between when relationships can be established with prospective donors or people donating material and the actual collection items coming to the library. There's some practical reasons for that, but mostly that's about trust and the time that it takes to build up trust in order for people to donate collections about who they are, who their family is, what their organisation is, who their interest group is and their community is to a collecting institution. So in short, New Zealand is changing significantly. The national collections does not reflect New Zealand now, and we're at great risk for it not reflecting New Zealand at all. Well, not at all, but not reflecting New Zealand significantly in the future. And it's going to take a considerable sustained effort to establish the relationships, create awareness and build trust in what collecting institutions are in order to start developing a national collection that reflects New Zealand as a nation. So why is this important? Some of the things that we've been discussing with our colleagues. If preservation and access to documentary heritage delivers a range of social, economic and cultural benefits, including supporting social cohesion through visibility, recognition and inclusion in national narratives, then not being part of the national collection is a mechanism of division, of marginalising and disengagement in national narratives. My colleague said this the other day. She said, imagining opening your family photo album only to find no image of yourself. So for me, a national collection enables some way for all New Zealanders to see themselves in the concept of who or what New Zealand is. There's a couple of legislative and policy settings which I think might be quite interesting to colleagues that are driving some of the shifts in thinking in New Zealand at the moment. From a legislative perspective, the National Library of New Zealand Act positions the library in a leadership role, not just for us, but across the country. There's only three purposes of the National Library. One is about collecting, preserving and protecting and making accessible documents, particularly those relating to New Zealand, and making them accessible for all the people of New Zealand. And one of the other ones is working collaboratively with institutions with similar purposes. And we've done an okay job in acquiring and collecting and preserving and providing access to collections, but the working collaboratively with other institutions with similar purposes has not really been intentionally worked on since the 2008 digital strategy that Fiona mentioned. And so there's a bit of momentum building up now to get the band back together and to start heading in that direction again. Several years ago, we significantly adjusted our collection policy settings at the National Library in order to position the library as a leader and coordinator of national collections. Not that we would be telling people what to be doing, but we now have this principle that the library is plays an important leadership role in collaborating and coordinating collection-related activities. It's on the slide there. You can read it. But I mean, that used to say that we make decisions that are aware of the collecting priorities of other institutions. But now we say the role is more about coordinating and leading and collaborating with others. It's a really quite powerful instruction to staff to just not collect and know what's going on, but to actively participate and collaborate. And that's sort of progressed to mixed success across the library, I would say. There's some really strong areas where it's really taken off. And I'll talk about a couple of them. And there's other areas where we're still sort of working across the system to build the right priorities for acquisition and collecting. But the policy settings also outlined priorities. And the priorities are designed to focus on building a national collection. So identifying the gaps that are in a national collection and proactively going about addressing them. And so it listed a whole lot of areas where the library is strong and it has collection strengths. And it still said that they are important to us, but that they wouldn't be actively sought. It then outlined a whole lot of what we called proactive priorities. And they're the ones where we're trying to marshal our resource into proactively establishing the relationships and documenting in order to document those gaps, some of those gaps of in the national documentary heritage estate, to better understand who we are and document who we are as a country. In changing some of those priorities, we've had to have some quite difficult conversations with donors who would expect the National Library to acquire their material, and we are not doing that anymore. And we're getting better at having some of those conversations, and we're also getting a bit better at articulating what we collect and why. But there's always more improvement to happen there. But a couple of recent interventions just within the library or collection priorities that I'll touch on now as examples. We focused on a couple of areas to get some success straight away, mostly focused on digital and using our web archiving and digital archiving capability. So the web offers quite a great opportunity to document parts of New Zealand society that, or parts of any society really, that that wouldn't necessarily be heard as part of the normal physical and analog process of packaging up collections and bringing them to a collecting institution. So we all know about Facebook. In New Zealand, about 65% of the country has a Facebook account. Facebook is both the realization of the magnificent promise of the social web, the bringing together of the communities, the creating of communities, etc. But it also has a dark side. Those big social media platforms are not neutral. They're designed to shape our thinking. They're designed to shape who we connect with and how we define our communities. They're spreaders of misinformation and hate as well. So we've noticed a lot of people leaving Facebook recently. So we created this option for people to download their personal archive and to make it part of the national collection, so that we can better document Facebook as a phenomenon in New Zealand, but also some of those stories and communities that have arisen as part of or arisen on Facebook. The emphasis here is on donation. So we've provided a whole lot of tools to enable people to download their own archive, and they can either keep it for themselves, and we provide some support for how they might do that, or instruction, but also then they can donate it to us, and they've got 3 access restrictions that they can choose from. One is just access within a reading room of the National Library. The other is restrict for 25 years and then make open, and the final one is restrict for 100 years and then make open. Most people are choosing making open within a reading room or the 25-year restriction. The National Library of New Zealand is also home to the New Zealand Cartoon Archive. Its focus was traditionally editorial cartoons, but we've recently refocused that to be cartoons and comics, and have deliberately scoped it to be a mechanism to better document communities that have little representation in our collection and in the national collection. Here's some representations of beneficiaries in the Cartoon Archive. Editorial cartoons relating to beneficiaries are predominantly amplifiers of stereotypes or racism, and that's very much so in the New Zealand Cartoon Archive. But we've recently worked with this community, which is a sort of a hashtag community that came together on Twitter and Instagram, called We Are the Beneficiaries, and it was a response to some political stuff going on in New Zealand. But predominantly there are artists and illustrators, cartoonists and comic artists, etc., who drew and wrote about their life on the benefit. And these are stories. These are very, very powerful stories, very personal stories that are just not documented anywhere else. I mean, they're just not documented in the national collections. And so we worked with the organisers of this community to ensure that everybody's story who was included in this archive gave permission for us to collect it. Another area of focus in our shift in collection policy was around areas of popular culture that are not part of the national narrative. Independent music is written about a lot, but there's very little in the way of archiving function for the independent music scene in New Zealand. So we changed the New Zealand Music Archive that's based at the National Library of New Zealand to have a focus on popular music. And really we positioned ourselves as the archive of the independent music scene. So this is Roger Shepherd from the Flying Nun Records label in New Zealand. And if you haven't heard of them, I recommend you find an album by The Clean and have a listen. This is the third independent music label where they've donated the entire master tape archive to us, and we're digitizing that, putting that online, and enabling the label and the bands to reissue from that. Three things that are kind of like shifting the focus of what the library does. I should say that with the Facebook project, we are working with other collecting institutions so that they can work with their communities to identify Facebook accounts that we can collect. So it's not just, it's kind of like a national effort. It's not just something that the National Library are doing. But really, we're trying to like shift it up at a national level. And I realize I've got a half-finished sentence here at a bullet point. So I'll wrap that up. That's what we're doing. But at the same time, part of my role is to try and make this work at a national level. So better put in place the mechanisms by which New Zealand documentary heritage institutions, or the GLAM sector with documentary heritage at its core, can understand common challenges, come together with strategies, with priorities that marshal the resources together for us to address some of the common challenges and needs. And here's what's emerging from some of those conversations at the moment. What to prioritize for collecting. We're thinking of some national prioritization sort of framework. Training and capability building around developing national collections, especially born digital collections. And there's a little bit of work going on there with some training suites that we are giving across the country, but it's some sustained effort and probably funding is required there. Digitization priorities around from the 2008 digital strategy that Fiona spoke about, still very much something that across the country people are wanting more guidance on and kind of a shared understanding on. Digital infrastructure. Fiona spoke about Digital New Zealand, but there's a couple of key other pieces of digital infrastructure that are where investment from galleries, museums, libraries, archives, community groups, etc., around the country. The funding of it, the funding required to do that at an institutional or community level is prohibited. So we're looking at how we can best pool or marshal some national funding around that. That's things like digital preservation platforms, improvements to Digital New Zealand, thinking about a non-digital New Zealand. So would something like Digital New Zealand, as Fiona said, it's not necessarily a national collection. It's a national collection of things digitized in New Zealand. But there's a lot of non-digitized items in New Zealand. So what would a national catalogue of documentary heritage in New Zealand look like, for example? There's a lot of policy work to do as well. Policy around copyright, policy around reuse, policy around data sovereignty, etc. that's starting to come out as a priority. But most importantly, I think what we've got to focus on is rebuilding the culture of collaboration and coordination across New Zealand. Fiona spoke about 2008. It really was a coming together of the sector in New Zealand, and some really beautiful, amazing things were developed from that. But I guess it's kind of been years of austerity, I would put it down to mostly, has meant that quite a lot of our sector is sort of entrenched back into its institutional corner. And now we've got to understand each other again. We've got to learn who each other is again and what our priorities are and how we work, and come together to find the common goals and to really build that culture of collaboration. So we've really only just started embarking on this journey. It's sort of towards a national collection, but it's more. It's sort of towards a national system of documentary heritage that ensures that the right things are preserved, they're protected, they're made accessible, and they're able to be used, and they're delivering value to New Zealand. So that's the journey that we've sort of started embarking on, and again in New Zealand, and that's part of my role. And so I look at the Toward a National Collection project in the UK with, I think you're just a couple of steps ahead of me. So that's great if you could continue to do so, because then I can learn from you as we build something similar in New Zealand. That's it from me. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I think we're going to go on to now our next speaker. If you'd like to share your screen, Professor.
Yep. Okay, thank you very much. I'm Akihiko Takano from National Institute of Informatics in Tokyo. And today I'd like to introduce a brief introduction about our new service, JapanSearch, which has officially kicked off last August. But before that, we have 1 year and a half pre-open period. And today I will use slides which are from the development team of National Diet Library. Yeah, these are their names. So let's start. Okay. So what is JapanSearch? The JapanSearch is designed to provide a platform for metadata of various content from GLAM institutes in Japan. The library has many books and manuscripts. Museums provide the cultural assets, picture of cultural assets or artworks, and the National Archive provide a collection of metadata of official documents and maps and etc. And the universities, of course, provide some kind of academic resources which are good for specialists, not necessarily be for the public, general public. But we try to provide a platform for collecting the old metadata of those institutes and create a new type of function for them. So our goals are how to enable a one-stop discovery service within Japan. And we also try to clarify secondary use conditions, which are not always clear even from the established institute. So by collecting those metadata information together with those conditions for reuse, the activities which we use all these informations will be activated, I believe. So as a result, the collection of those metadata can be distributed as a volume set of information, what kind of digital information we actually use for various activities. So we hope these goals will promote the innovative use of these digital content in Japan. So who we are. JapanSearch is a governmental activities with a cross-sectoral project. So many ministries get together and support those activities, not by budget, but for maybe spirits at this moment. And so JPS administration policy is established by the government fund committee, and the underlying that committee, there is a practitioner reviewing committee, which is a collection of practitioners from all different genres of our digital archives. I am a chair of this practitioner committee, so today I'm here. I'm not a member of National Diet Library, but I know a lot of their policy. Actually, we have discussed much of those collection policies or service policy together with DL people. The system itself, JapanSearch system itself, has been developed by National Diet Library, and they are responsible for operating as a service. National Diet Library spared 15 staff members, which are collected from 5 different branches, sections within National Diet Library, and they spend much their times to create this service. And all these necessary budget is from National Diet Libraries right now. And here's a short history of the development of our of this JapanSearch. Almost 4 years ago, 2017 April, we started this discussion about what kind of activities we should design for promote the activities around the digital archives within this country, within Japan. And so after some hard discussions, JPS JapanSearch project is actually born, and the NDL take that responsibility for creating the prototype of that. And we released the prototype service in 2019 February, and after 1.5 years, we officially launched the service. And so in Japan, each ministry is, I don't know about the other country, but at least in Japan, each ministry has tried to keep their land, and they never join and create this kind of project. So this time we are lucky to have this kind of rather high level committee, which urge us to create the new project. Okay, so for designing the JapanSearch system, we insist to keep these 3 principles. So first one is, do not assume a fixed format for handling metadata, because the scope of JapanSearch is vary from library to museums and official documents from National Archives. So it is not easy to assume the one common format for all of those data. So we try to use a rather flexible metadata handling to realize that. Later I will explain it a little more detail. Second one is, as a service, we want to deliver an attractive one. So quick response is crucial, and flexible search function is also necessary. Of course, we cannot compete with Google or that kind of GAFA services, but considering the collection of the quality of the collected information, I hope we will have a land to compete with them. The third one is advanced technical requirements, which we try to use modern technology or the modern requirements we try to satisfy. So, for example, the mobile first approach or browser support is should be necessary, and we want to care about IIIF, which is now becoming a de facto standard for international exchange of image things, and SNS support is of course necessary, and multilingual support, which is not trivial in case of Japan, but we insist to deliver it at least English and Japanese. And the API is, of course, we need to provide, and search engine optimization, we need to not only a search function, but also a kind of generated content, which should be seen attractive from the search engine or the users. And accessibility, universal accessibility is necessary to consider. And of course, we have to be prepared for linked open data approach. So we provide the contents as LDF summary. And so the system itself has these four components, but today I want to dive into detail of those technical things, but later I will tell you some. Okay, to realize this, we need to connect all these participating institute and collect metadata and junk into our service. And so we borrow the similar approach as Europeana. So here's a diagram which we are using. So participant institute provide the metadata, but not individually, but we ask some group of those participants create some community to discuss about what kind of metadata structure should be proper for that area. And from these aggregators, we receive the collected metadata. But of course, there are not all participants can be grouped up. So of course, we also pick some independent participants for joining us. And these are the infrastructure and the utilization layer. The JapanSearch collects all this information and somehow cooked the metadata in more usable way and provide a service to various users. So we have no priority among all these users group. So we have to consider the general public, of course, the educator or the students, or some people are keen about the disaster recovery information from all these things, and the more professional users with digital humanities background. So right now, up to now, we haven't restrict or put special focus on either of these user group, but eventually we will expect some group stands up and they have more feedbacks to improve our services. So right now we have collected 21 million metadata from 118 database and through the 24 aggregators. So if you are interested to see the actual institute or metadata things, collectors, please refer to this page. And from here, I will briefly discuss with what kind of scheme of common properties mapping to collect the metadata. So traditional method like Europeana or other things are prepare some standard metadata schema, and you try to map the all participant metadata into one. But here we adopt we have picked some field as a common properties, and we try to map for that part only, and the rest of the field, rest of the metadata information we keep as original, and just add them. And so the common feature for search function is heavily used this common properties, but not the structure of the rest of the metadata. So that's a little bit different approach, I believe. So using that things, the data providers has been the metadata from original institute is cooked and converted to the this kind of informations, and later JapanSearch itself publish this information, this partly normalized information using LDF scheme. And okay. So the concept and the idea we try to deliver, designed our service of JapanSearch, we focus on 3 activities: search, use, and enjoy. And so, of course, the search function, it could be basic, the very crucial one. So, of course, not only we provide a universal cross database search, but also we provide some customized version of search function. So you can easily cook what type of information you are searching or what type of field your search should be. So it's a kind of not the faceting of the search result, but the faceting of the search function. You can understand. And for enjoy, we provide a gallery or the function of editor to provide that using a kind of a collection, a meaningful collection of contributed informations, and as one collection of informations. As through visiting this page, the user can realize, oh, how variety we have collected, and the value of those variety is not trivial. Okay. So we also provide a node function to customize the collection of that for use abilities. So we can collect, our service has host this kind of node to redistribute among users. And also we use this function for workspace community results or the project space, which are not necessarily open to public, but the limited group of people can use this function for their own crucial informations without opening up. So that's the basic things we covered. So future plans, we need to familiarize the public JapanSearch is how useful, and empower users and partner communities. Maybe we need to deliver some kind of grade up to the outside users for that, using this basic function of JapanSearch, and expand scope of cooperation for local digital resources is of course necessary. We have decided 3 years extension of our committee, so we are now start discussing what kind of strategy should be necessary to expand our scope. So organize a community responsibility for common schema and metadata, which is it is not trivial. So for example, the newspaper group, or the special collection of metadata, we need the careful special design for the metadata for them. And for those discussions, NDL team is not suffice to provide a solution. So we need a collaborative structure among these people. So I think we run out of my time. So as a final sheet, we add this one. And this is Culture Japan, which is a new service which are formally independent from JapanSearch, but heavily use the JapanSearch function, and also which covers DigitalNZ and Europeana and DPLA to collect the Japan-related information more international way and provide a similar function for JapanSearch or even more. So that's if you have any question or further inquiries, please send us. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for all our speakers. Apologies to Fiona and Mark. I said some absolutely lovely things after you'd spoken, but I'm pretty sure nobody heard them. So can you hear me this time? Carlotta, give me a nod.
Yes, yes.
Super. Okay, it's absolutely fantastic for us as the project team to hear what you guys have been developing and sparking off all sorts of ideas about how we think about the future. But I'd like to maximize the time on questions from the participants here. Carlotta, how are we doing on any submitted questions?
We have 3 questions for now. So one is for Akihiko, is for JapanSearch. So we can start with this about metadata. And it's Karen Sayers is asking, what type of metadata does the material or method category harvest for the search interface in JapanSearch? It's a very technical question. So perhaps if you need more elaboration, we can ask Karen to elaborate.
Yes, actually, we haven't limited the type of variety of metadata. We are, as long as the aggregator agreed, they sent us the original form. So, but for our service, we limit that common part for sophisticated search functions, but rest of the things is added as a more descriptional information for those items. So I don't know I'm clear enough, but so that's common part and the rest of the part. And the rest of the part, the participant institute has full freedom to send us.
Thank you. We have a question for Mark. It's about building up trust. So what you were saying about, it was a very interesting part. And so Wendy Andrews is asking if you can say more about how you are building trust, what kind of strategies and activities you're using to do that.
Thanks for the question, Wendy. It's a difficult one. when I was sort of researching our approaches in recent times, I look back as to what the library had done previously, and there were literally files of letters that have been written by the National Librarian or the Chief Librarian out to various people, but they were normally introducing themselves and saying we're interested in your collection. But that was when the focus was very much on building a collection of the noteworthy and of the already kind of known people in New Zealand. And so now the approach is quite different. There's a few strands to it. One is about using our exhibition and our access functions. Where we use the space in the National Library now for events, for talks, for family days, and for exhibitions that in some part, it's part of our deliberate program to target aspects of New Zealand society that wouldn't normally know that a National Library exists or that a collecting institution exists or what they do. We have sort of embarked on it's been a priority for a few years now actually to have events that sort of bring people to the library, right? And that's a way of establishing connections, and then you go from there. But still, that's very much sort of limited on people coming to us. We are getting better, and some people in our profession are better than others at doing this, but introducing ourselves, sending an email and saying, hey, this is who we are, can we come and talk? And going to the annual meetings of associations of interest groups and just saying who we are and what our interest is. A sort of key element of the messaging around that is not necessarily that the National Library wants to take your memories and put them into our big repository and look after them, but more so that we're just interested in in ensuring that the right kind of stories are being protected and held and available for use into the future. And that doesn't necessarily mean that they come to the National Library. There was a shift in focus in the collection policy as well. So when we've engaged with a new community group or whatever, part of the strategy is also, you don't have to deposit anything anywhere, but do you want some advice or some training or some follow-up on how to look after that collection yourself? How do you to support to ensure that you're looking after retaining the right information through time to A, for your own purposes, but B, so that the work you do is able to be known later. So that's part of the strategy as well. And the other is just using the network of people that we know for introductions. And as I said, this stuff takes time. It's proper strategy, and it's not going to bear fruit potentially for many years, maybe even decades. And so I think it's quite important to sustain the culture within the library and the strategy within the library where we're developing and working for and building relationships for the long term is just a natural part of what we do. So yeah, it's a tricky business, and I hope that answers your question, Wendy.
And there's a sort of a follow-up question about, again, public and DigitalNZ. So Richard Light is asking, Mark or Fiona, you can answer this. When the NZ public were asked what data DigitalNZ should collect, did you get any surprises from the responses?
Kia ora. Thanks, Richard. I just want to check. Are you talking about who we should be, the collections we should be pointing to, or was it my reference to the voting tool? I'll speak to both. So in terms of...
Sorry, I got the impression that there was an open call as to what data you should actually be collecting, and maybe I misunderstood that. But so, you know, the whole question of what should we be recording is, you know, a really big one for our community. So when you actually asked the public, I was fascinated to know what they came back with?
Yeah, so in that example, it was asking the public what should be digitized. And it was a voting tool where they would identify things to be digitized and then people would vote for it. So yeah, there were a few surprises there, but then also it was more about people not understanding the challenges of copyright. In terms of data and collecting what we should be pointing to and collecting, we just tried to point to everything we can and work with the widest range of content partners possible. So we're not limited to the GLAM sector. We work with charitable organisations, whoever has digital content that relates to New Zealand, including international organisations. So if anyone out there has New Zealand content in their collections, we could be talking with you. So I haven't really answered your question, but then again, maybe I have.
Thank you. There's a question again related to the principles, I guess, behind these projects, and this one is for JapanSearch. Jen Ross, would you like to ask a question, or would you want me to read it out loud? It's the.
I'll just see if I can get my.
Yep, it's working.
Yeah, you can hear me okay? Yeah, I found the comment that the value of variety is not trivial to users to be really interesting. And I wondered, Akihiko, did you consider that this was an underpinning principle for JapanSearch? Or is it more of an effect of the approach that you took, if you see what I mean?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, actually, yes, our approach, our original approach, I think, that I was inspired. I insist to provide this kind of a gallery contents on top of our site, because without that, you can just search and end up with a very, very diverse results, and sometimes nothing, sometimes tons of information from one field, which blind the small interesting aspects in different fields. So I think we need some kind of editorial process for showcasing the value of our service. So I think I'm inspired, at least, by the National Bibliothèque Nationale, BNF, French National Library provide a Gallica, which is, of course, you know, the encyclopedic approach for sorting the value of their collected information. So I think we tried to deliver the similar contents to prove the value of our service.
Thank you. I found that really fascinating.
Thank you.
There is a double question by Arianna Chula. So one for NZ and one for JapanSearch. So if you would like to ask both of your questions live, otherwise I can read them for you.
Thanks, I can do that. Thanks to both speakers and also to the organizers. They're interesting presentations. My first question is about capability, really. If you could say more about the expertise behind the Digital New Zealand. And I think Fiona at least hinted at some point about the issue of under-resourced services. So I wonder if you could say more about the challenges around not only designing, developing, but also maintaining these national collections and the digital infrastructure behind it. And then for the JapanSearch speaker, the question was more about again, you kind of answered already replying to others, but about the Europeana model. You mentioned that you adopted that. So I wanted to know a bit more about what you meant by that. Is that about the common metadata model or the specific RDF schema that you adopted, or is more in general about the architecture for the infrastructures? Thank you.
Shall I go first? Thanks for the question, Arianna. So yeah, challenges and around resourcing. So I was referring to some rather austere years that we had in the middle of the teens, the 20 teens, where we we're not able to invest quite as much as we would have liked to keep innovating and really making a space where we could be helping organisations across the country to innovate with their collection data. So I guess what I was trying to say is that if you're doing some stuff and you're wanting to keep it going, make sure that you've got some certainty of funding along the way. Is that answering your question? You talk about capability as well and expertise. Do you mean?
Yes, I think I basically just wanted to hear maybe a bit more about the importance indeed of those experts behind these resources and the stability of that expertise to ensure that that these things keep going in a way and are alive and are produced with quality behind it.
Yeah, so having a core team, so based out of National Library of New Zealand. So National Library took a lead and received the funding for setting up Digital New Zealand and then running it, and then it's become an ongoing service, but making sure that it has the investment that it needs to run the team behind it. So in terms of the expertise within the team, metadata harvesting, we work with an external development company to help with the development of the front end, but also the back end as well. So rather than having in-house development, we work with a company that we've actually been working with for a very long time. So technically they're a remote team. But within the team, we have systems expertise, metadata harvesting expertise to run Supplejack, and also community management, which is of course very important to build the engagement with the service, because value is in the use.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you for asking. And I mean the Europeana style, or similar to Europeana, is only the structure of the collecting information. So aggregation structure we learned from Europeana, because our team at NDL is rather small and we have no plan to expand that large. And so we need how to manage the scales of the blows up of the participating institute. So we need to provide the structure in the beginning. From the beginning, we need to ask the structure for the aggregation and for the collecting metadata. Thank you.
Thank you. We have a question from our YouTube follower. He's asking, what have been to any of you, what have been the biggest non-technical challenges to enable the cross-collection discovery? Has it been the usual resources, time, trust? Can you comment on this? Who would like to go first?
Can we have a volunteer?
I'm just thinking, the challenges, it is getting the organisations to put their time aside to work with us to try and make sure that we're representing their data in the way that they want to. So it's the collaboration, basically. So we can work at a certain pace to try and do the technical side of things, but it's actually working with people and organisations to show what the value of including your information and your content in the service and why it's a good thing, and then getting them to do QA and those sort of things. So it's time and telling them the story and showing the value of what they're doing, what we're doing.
Okay. Could I come in with a question, Carlotta?
Yeah, sure.
A big part of our Towards a National Collection programme is about funding research into how collections can be brought together and exploring all different methodologies and ways of engaging with the public. So that's very key for us at this underpinning stage of thinking about the future. I wondered from your projects whether you had a similar stage of research, not just within the practitioner teams putting it together, but in partnership with the academic communities.
I can maybe address that. Firstly, by saying we very much look forward to your research and learning from that. We haven't been great with that, to be honest, in terms of research. There's been bits and pieces around the place, but I think sort of Fiona mentioned the sort of austere funding that we've had both centrally in New Zealand, but across the country in recent times. It's unfortunate that research seems to be one of the things that goes first. But if you look on the National Library webpage, there's a section on research reports, and there were some things that were done sort of around 5 or so years ago that I think still provide quite a lot of interest into the value of the work we do and some of the issues in building communities and engaging with collections. One was called Kōrero Kitea, and that was a research project that looked about what happens, how are people using digitized Te Reo Māori collections, so digitized Indigenous language collections from New Zealand. And the idea there is that we were finding out what was going on outside of this sort of access point. It's one of the particular sort of interest areas of mine is that from within our sector, we often very much focus on access and then don't really know what happens with our collections, how they're used, the extent to which they're shared, what kind of difference they're making in people's lives. And so it was an idea to sort of to have a look at that. And we then found some pretty strong connections to macro government policies and the Māori language strategies in New Zealand. So there's also research on understanding the needs of the wider GLAM sector on collecting born digital and the needs there and how we can best sort of service that. What's traditionally happened in New Zealand is that when an institution who's got some sort of starting to take that journey on collecting born digital, maybe it's a photograph collection or something, they come to the National Library or a large institution and say, can you help us? And we've tended to, or we used to, tend to like send them our specs and send them our process docs and say, here you are, this is what we do. And it's really incomprehensible to a lot of institutions around the country who maybe, you know, a small team or 1 or 2 people. So we've put a whole lot of training in place now to support that. And that was, a lot of that came out of the research that and what the needs were. I can't quite remember some of the other research projects that have been in place. Some was around digitization priorities, etc. So that's a long way to say there hasn't been much. There used to be a little bit, but there's not much, and we really don't have a research program in place. So I'd be very much interested in learning from towards a national collection as to what the research program is and how it's progressing once you get cracking.
Great. Well, we do have teams who've been working for the last year, including one on Born Digital. I think Kaya's on the call, I spotted, so I'm sure she'll be interested if she hasn't seen your reports already to be passing them on to the PI. Back to you, Carlotta.
Yes, we have another question from YouTube, and this is it applies to both, since you both have very extensive partnerships. Did you have any partners withdraw previously given data? And I'm guessing the follow-up question would be, what do you do? How did you face that?
We've had one, and it was related to copyright, basically. What we did in order to be able to bring thumbnails to display thumbnail images is defined thumbnails as metadata within our terms, the way that the terms that we have with our content partners. So we have a letter of agreement that says this is what we're going to do with your data, and we want you to allow us to display a thumbnail, because seeing a thumbnail of an image is going to have be a much better discovery experience. And one partner challenged that and decided that was too risky for their organisation. Just the one, no one else has had that problem. And in order to deal with that, we have an agreement that if someone's not happy, we'll just remove them from the search index and not make them available anymore. And then we've worked with that partner to try and work out what are their parameters for keeping their content, their metadata still involved. Yeah, so not many at all. And we haven't had many problems with people misusing the data or the content in any way either. But this one partner was a little more risk averse around what we're doing and how we're doing it, and their interpretation of copyright.
Professor Takano, would you like to?
Yeah. For JapanSearch, as far as I know, there's no such withdrawal database. But some of the database we have discussed informally before we put into service. I expect they are delivering the much more larger thumbnails and informations, but in the process of discussing and the signing up the contract, they review the state of their copyright things, and as a result, they stop delivering those. They decided not to deliver those information. So I think it's a similar situation as Fiona case.
Do you have time for one more question, Rebecca?
Yeah, if you do one more, and I'd like to do a final one if I can.
Okay, there's a Natasha Hodson. I don't know if you'd like to ask your questions about the strategies in place for DigitalNZ for reaching the communities that have not traditionally participated.
Yeah, I mean, I think in part possibly Mark just answered that slightly, but I just wanted to know how they would deal. I mean, obviously in creating a national collection, how do you deal with technological inequalities, especially in the user end, making sure that people do have access to these things? And is there, do you have specific strategies for reaching certain communities? I'd be interested.
That's a great question, Natasha, and I can speak to it particularly from the Digital Pacific example that I covered off, which is kind of like Digital New Zealand, but for the Pacific. It doesn't fully address the issue, but what we made sure that we did is design the interface and the experience to be able to be accessed on 2G, mobile phone 2G, and to be as light as possible, and we took an eco-friendly design to the interface as well, so that Pacific communities in the Pacific, in the very widest Pacific, would at least be able to see the site and interact with it if they had data and enough connectivity. The harder nut to crack is, of course, those that don't have the data and connectivity, and how we can get through to that. And that's, a bigger strategic issue around digital inclusion. But another thing we do with Digital New Zealand is work very closely with schools and school librarians. In the National Library, we're quite unique in that we have a whole branch of the library which is responsible for supporting school libraries and school librarians and schools with accessing resources and information, and designing online information in a way that it will meet the curriculum and support teaching and learners.
That's great, thank you.
So I'd just really like to make the most of the speakers we've got here today for our future programme. I wonder whether each of you would be willing to say whether you've done something wrong. In other words, what should we avoid doing? What have you tried that's failed that we should stay away from? And perhaps on a more positive note to finish, what's your one key piece of advice for us going forward? Anyone willing to take that one on?
I'll start. Great question. I'm not sure if it's something that we've done wrong. It's just sort of observations that we are sort of making now that we're starting to embark on a similar journey to you. And it was a place we were at kind of 12 to 15 years ago, and sort of looking at the void in between happen. And I guess it's a recommendation is to sort of encourage you to invest in collaboration at a leadership level. I know there's times, and we're only just sort of realizing it now when we see the leaders of our national institutions, including the sort of larger institutions up and down the country, be together, talk about things, talk about their strategies, talk about the value of working together. And I really do honestly think that that filters down throughout our GLAM sector. So I would encourage you to, as part of your program, to invest in understanding what collaboration is and how best to sustain that, both within your program and beyond it.
That is excellent and incredibly timely piece of advice for us. Thank you. Professor Takano, what shouldn't we do or what must we do?
Yeah, because our activities are still very young, so I think there's no not to do task in the recommendation, but it's I think we still have a difficulty to mix the existing community from museums, libraries, or the archival documents, and they are very strict principles of themselves. And to mix the metadata, it is sometimes very convenient, but they are very reluctant to change their way of thinking or the collect information or the mix them up. So I think we are not successful yet, but it's I hope we can push back all these collected information to their site, to their collections, to enrich their collection of informations. Through that way, I believe, we have a nice way to massage their stick and hard thinking for more freestyle way. So that's my recommendation or my dream to realize.
Thank you. We shall join you in your dream. Fiona, you've been with Digital Search longer. Is there anything you're willing to admit you wouldn't do again?
Yeah, I can think of several things. I'm just working out what to share with you. I touched on something actually when I was talking, and that was how easy we've made it for our partners to participate, which has had lots and lots of benefits for us because we've been able to get the scale and get a very wide range of content and metadata into the system. But at the same time, it's been very easy for people to forget that they're part of us. And so we're not maintaining that buy-in and that sort of collective community that we could have with our content partners. And I think we could and should be doing a bit more to build that community. So it's getting the investment into the engagement, not only with people using the site, but also the community that's part of that site as well. And then the other thing was around the terms for data. So I talked about us being a little bit ahead of the game. So we were ahead of Europeana and others when they were pulling together what an API looks like and how you manage the data licensing. So we took quite a conservative approach where we said the metadata can only be used for non-commercial use, and then it's a bespoke license, so to speak, rather than us being able to go for a Creative Commons license. So I look very jealously at Europeana and their CC0 licensing for data, and the fact that they got their partners on board with that at that time, because there was more buy-in with that approach by then. But that was a matter of timing rather than a mistake. And you know, we're still trying, but we are where we are.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. And thank you for everyone else who asked questions that you didn't, sorry, the questions in the chat that you didn't get to ask. I hope you'll forgive me for seeking a bit of advice for our programme. I'm sort of feeling an international support group coming on for everyone working in this area. So we'd certainly be delighted if we could keep in touch with you. And maybe next time we'll be the ones on the unsociable hours and you can look a bit happier. So I'm going to have to draw it to a close because we're a little bit over time. So I'd just like to thank hugely our speakers for sharing their experience. That's been fantastically interesting. As Carlotta said, this is the start of a series of seminars looking elsewhere in the world for ideas for our new support group. And we'll be announcing soon the next projects and programs that will be available to speak to you all. We also just wanted to take the chance today to quickly plug a domestic seminar series, which Colin will put the links in the chat. Our foundation projects, our initial set of research projects, have just or are just about to publish their interim reports, and they will be presenting those, 6 of our projects will be presenting those in February. And if anyone would like to attend and come and hear more about the detail of what those projects have managed to achieve and what their next steps are, you'd be very welcome. So thank you so much everyone for attending. I wish I had a wee dram to send to all our speakers before you went to bed. You'll just have to imagine it. But thank you so much and goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks very much. Thank you.
Kai kite anō.
Goodbye.
Okay, well done everyone behind this. Let's leave this call and go and get ourselves a cup of tea.